from personal empowerment to social empowerment and social justice with Jack Kirkner, who offers an allocentric societal yoga, modern interpretations and applications of traditional yoga philosophy.
Namaste. My project is Allocentric Societal Yoga, but really it's yoga philosophy for social unrest and political crisis. And this project was really driven by our recent election and a lot of the policy initiatives that you saw that worked against the environment, against women, against minorities, difficulties with our foreign policy, as well as noticing all of the mobilization and the protests and the resistance that were happening. And it drove this idea that how can yoga philosophy be used to guide protest resistance strategies, especially at a larger level, at the societal level. So the allocentric perspective is simply to take yoga philosophy and view it at one level for how it can affect and influence and benefit others. And then the societal aspect is taking individual yogic principles and reformulating them into a larger scale so we can see benefits for society. So much like the yoga philosophy applied to the individual deals with the suffering, we can use and develop strategies to eliminate the suffering of society. So I based a little bit of this on Yoga Sutras 113, 115 with Vairagya and Abhyasa, where Patanjali describes the method of yoga as being these two. So detachment I'm looking at as the individual side and Abhyasa, the practice, as the societal side. So detachment is literally detaching from society, and the societal side is becoming attached and putting your yoga practice out into society, into other people. So what I developed to take into the look at the research and the data is what I call the Yoga Guna protest resistance theory. So the three gunas, we have sattvic, which is harmonious and illuminating, rajasic, which is energetic, and tamasic, which would be very heavy. So what I do is sattvic would be, in the yogic tradition, a nonviolent, harmonious solution. And really what's important in this study is this idea that in yoga philosophy, it's not defeating your enemy, it's transforming your enemy into a friend. And this was Gandhi, this was MLK, but it's this parinama, this idea that's so important in yoga philosophy that the goal is transformation. And so Rajas ends up being protest, and tamasic ends up being resistance. So the protest side is active, it's organized, it's based on communication, and then the resistance side would be passive, disruptive, and heavy. So, protest side would be, examples would be like the Salt March of Gandhi or the March on Washington with Martin Luther King. And then tamasic would be things like Swadeshi, which was the boycott movement during India's independence. So I took these into studying some data to see how yoga philosophy would work during social crisis and political unrest. And the methodology, I take a couple of instances of taking yoga philosophy and applying it to itself. So the pramanas of Samkhya are essentially ways that you establish knowledge. And so these are my chapters. So Shabda is the story of India's independence through the reliable testimony. And I work in reverse of what happens in the Karika. But Anumana is inference, where I look at yoga philosophy existing outside of direct yogic influence at times of social unrest and political crisis. And then the last chapter, Pratyaksha, is my direct perception on these ideas. So to begin Shabda, I start with Swami Vivekananda, because he had a great call to action in his interpretation of the Gita to really start this movement, to start participating, and to look at one's yogic practice as a societal outlet. And he also had what he considered his Vedantic ideal, which was to consider all things to be equal to the highest principle, all things to be equal to the highest goal. And this is kind of the framework that one takes as you enter yoga philosophy into societal applications. I then look at Sri Aurobindo, because he started when he was young in the Indian independence movement as a militant revolutionary, and he changed into adopting more yogic principles and became student of passive resistance, and eventually he laid the groundwork for Gandhi. And Aurobindo would retire and affect the movement in Pondicherry through his writings quite a bit. And lastly, I get to the Mahatma and the liberation of India, and I go over some of his ideas. What's important here is really what Gandhi was doing is similar to this project, is taking yoga philosophy and interpreting it and applying it to the current situations. So Satyagraha was Gandhi's use of Jain philosophy, of the Mahabharatas, of creating this template for nonviolent resistance. And he also had Sarvodaya, which means the uplift of all, which was important with his vision of including all parts of society, and this will come up later. And so he was working with women, he was working with the illiterate, he was working with the rural, he was working with the poor. And this is really perhaps what was the genius of what Gandhi was working with, because he also tested these things out in real settings. The Tolstoy farm was his ashram in South Africa, the Satyagraha ashram in India. And so what I did with these three in the Yoga Guna protest resistance theory is Vivekananda was the rajasic, was the energetic side of things. Aurobindo had this as tamasic because he influenced so much with his writing, and he really did retire to Pondicherry in 1915. 1920, the Mahatma comes back from South Africa, and I look at him as the Sattvic Guna because he was the one that actually got India's independence. He was the one that got India liberated. So when I look at Animana, the next chapter, this is the mark of yoga philosophy in places perhaps outside of the direct influence of the yogic tradition. So what I looked for in the American Civil Rights Movement with MLK was, were there ideas that continued this rajasic and tamasic side of things with the protest theory? And what I found was, of course, you have very rajasic things like the March on Washington, and you have tamasic endeavors as well, like the sit-ins in 1961, the bus boycott, even you could look at Rosa Parks as a tamasic endeavor as well. So I also look at the current situation with the Standing Rock Sioux, and I bring them up because of the way that the 7 Lakota values give a framework, a cultural and ethical framework for not only their resistance struggle, but how they train people to participate in the resistance struggle. So I look at the 7 Lakota values, and then I associate them with yogic principles that are vital in this general storyline. The last part of the inference chapter is Swami Madan, who is fighting a battle, an environmental battle in the Ganges to prevent riverbed mining. And I bring him up because it seems as though the modern epicenter of yoga philosophy in social unrest seems to be environmental. And he's also a student of Gandhi's. He's an expert in fasting and demands truth and really works the media, which we'll see that these are important principles later. So how yoga philosophy works in social unrest and political crisis, what I did was all those case studies, I took and identified these principles that I saw to be very, very vital. And I created this thing that I refer to as the path of Kriya Karma Yoga. So it plays on this detachment and practice modality as well, where Kriya is the inner and Karma is the outer. And Kriya being transformation and Karma being action, I call this the path of transformative action. And this is really what yoga protest resistance theory is about, is this transformative action. So the way it works is essentially going back and forth between these two schools of yoga. And, sorry. So it starts with svadhyaya, which is self-study. And it's in the societal aspect, it's also the study of your condition. So for instance, with India's independence, it was just the knowledge that this was unrighteous and that India was not free. So the intensive self-study leads to the karma side, which is your dharma. What is your duty in this situation? It comes back then to Ishvara Pradidhana, which is this dedication to a cause. And after you realize your duty, it's this fire that is lit in you to participate. Then yajna, which is sacrifice, is a particular type of sacrifice, which is this sacrifice of the small self, the sacrifice of the ego for the greater good of the movement. Then tapas. After you sacrifice the ego, you are in this position where you can withstand the dualities of the difficulties of protest. And then your response to tapas is nonviolent, is ahimsa, and this is what leads to the sattvic outcome. So if you look at, just as an example, like Rosa Parks, she may have studied the situation with the busing and her place in it, and felt a call to do something, and felt that this was an important endeavor for the entire civil rights movement. So the movement was bigger than she was. She made a personal sacrifice. She sacrificed herself for the greater cause. But what if you get arrested? What if they beat you? This is the endurance of tapas. And her response, if it's nonviolent, which it was, ahimsa, leads to this sattvic result. And really, in 1 year after Rosa Parks' incident, President Eisenhower in 1957 would enact the Civil Rights Act. So it was a very potent procedure. And so I've identified, as I looked at all these case studies, 9 points of this protest resistance theory, and I give them yogic and Sanskrit titles. So the first one, and this comes from Gandhi, this comes from MLK, and some new researchers, G. Sharp and Peter Ackerman, that are also students of nonviolent social conflict. So yoga is unite. It's get the organization going. It's the NAACP. It's the Indian National Congress, which Gandhi was the head of. Samya is this balance and equality, which kind of works two ways. I noticed that one is like Gandhi utilizing women and the poor especially, using balance throughout society for the movement. And then equality you kind of see with MLK, where he would fill the ranks with talented individuals. It's not just the top, it's all the way through. And a lot of the initiatives that were started during the civil rights movement were actually started by college students and people that we would consider to be lower on the ladder. Next one I consider prana, which is energy. And this is like with Standing Rock, the resource allocation for the movement. So you saw with Standing Rock tons of donations, people donating their time, their material goods, their talents to the cause. And you will need resources. And then Bhaya Bhavana is cultivating external support. So this would be much like, as an example with President Trump, finding right-wing Christians and explaining to them that Trump is not actually a Christian, to undermine their support for him. Or in Standing Rock, recruiting veterans to participate in the protest against the government. And this is closely related to undermining the opponent's support, Pratipaksha Bhavana. So through this way, you can cultivate, as an example, Gandhi working with the Muslims to create a formidable opponent that's beyond your individual group. So the fifth point is quite large, which is just this incorporation generally of cultural and ethical and moral guidelines to framework your protest theory. So I go through all of the yamas and the niyamas and interpret them in the ways that they might work with society, but also work in these protest strategies. So obviously ahimsa, nonviolent transformations, and you can see how they're somewhat different because of their societal applications. For instance, brahmacharya, energy allocation in the movement, and this is what these leaders have been so deft at, was keeping the motivation of the movement going through resource allocation, energy allocation, aparigraha, giving back to the cause, donating to these things that you find to be important. So the sixth one is dharma, and this comes from Swami Vivekananda, which is the worst thing you can do is nothing. You have to get up, you have to engage your opponent if you're going to enact social change. Drishti is getting the struggle to be viewed, and a major part of both Gandhi and MLK was how they used the press, how they conducted interviews. Even with Gandhi, he was such a prolific writer, and his ideas and his books were extremely powerful and transformational during India's independence. And then I coined this term, or used this term, ahimsagraha, which is maintaining a nonviolent approach, and it gets more and more important at this point as you get closer to the end. So, and this is derived from Gandhi's writings, where from like 1942 on, he would consider ahimsa to be something that you would risk your life over. Because he knew at that point, if there was a violent reaction to the British rule, that everything would have come undone. And so similarly, if you look at Standing Rock, or you look at the American Civil Rights Movement, if there were violent uprisings, it would have killed the whole movement. And so holding on to this nonviolent reaction is really what gets this sattvic result. And then ekagrata, which is keeping the goal of the movement in mind. And I derive this from Gandhi because so many times the British offered concessions. That was not India's independence. It was not Britain leaving India. And that's what Gandhi's goal was. And so he was able to constantly focus on India's liberation, and that was it. And that was really what was important about framing the whole movement. So in conclusion, I feel very passionate about this project because it affects the way we learn and teach and practice yoga, but it has a lot of applications to possibly changing society. And there's such a unique climate with yoga today, and we're at a turning point almost in history where we begin to take yoga into society. We begin to affect society in great ways. And these projects you see here have this inside of them, this social aspect of yoga. And so yes, yoga can change, refugee status. You'll see yoga for educational status, but really these things, it's a great movement and it's a great aspect of yoga. And in the future, hopefully yoga can be involved in saving our world.
Is there any way you're engaging with the protesting communities to explain this philosophy or this hermeneutic framework of yoga, and they can see their protest?
Yeah, so mostly I've been able to interact with the Standing Rock in the American Indian community because there's a number of situations that are similar to Standing Rock. Another one is called Flat Oak in Arizona, which is a sacred burial site of the Apache that the U.S. government is trying to mine on. So a lot of these things, I was in the developmental stage and execution stage. I really think, similar to Daniela, the execution stage is yet to come. So a lot of this was me kind of operating with humility to try to understand these things before I was able to start combining things. But I tried to give a research vision that included a bunch of things that were in the yogic tradition, outside of the yogic tradition, but had enough that I could analyze these yogic principles that were throughout all of them. I hope that answers your question.
Can I ask one more? I was just curious why you would classify the Swadeshi movement under tamas. I mean, what's the distinction between rajas and tamas?
So,
because tamas is a quality that is also associated with ignorance.
Yes,
right?
yes, and yeah.
So
but,
where do you draw the line?
So a lot of this is, okay, so tamas, you have a paragraph of English words you can use, right? So as you approach how you're going to configure or reinterpret yoga philosophy, you have to extract these translation angles. So lazy translation, people assuming that because Max Mueller translated it this way, this is what it means, is to deny the evolution of yoga, which is really the core of it. So Swadeshi, the big part of it was boycott. Was self-sufficiency through not supporting British goods. So in that way, it was tamasic because I'm not going to do this. It wasn't something that I'm going to do. It was a boycott of not buying. And the movement, yes, is about a proactive generality, which is self-sufficiency. However, the breakdown of a lot of these specific strategies happens in Rajasic and Tamasic ways. So just identifying the boycott side of that complex term is what was the Tamasic side of things. Yeah. Mainly based on boycott. Good. Thank you.